Today, I'm joined by two of the hosts of Scrutiny, a podcast that provides in-depth, accessible, and irreverent analysis of the Supreme Court. Leah Littman and Melissa Murray, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
You mentioned how important this election is, and I would just like to stress this election is very important. I think our listeners know that. But what happens if we all get out there, we do our part, right? The country votes, we get the majority of people plus the Electoral College, and Trump doesn't accept the results, right? What might happen? Like, is there a potential that we do everything right and it still just goes to shit?
So I guess I want to say at the top of this question that, that is kind of what happened in 2020. And yet, that's led to horrific consequences, including January 6th. But it also still resulted in the winner of the presidential election ascending to the office of the presidency. And it did so in part because the margin of victory was what we call on our show litigation proof. The margins were so large, none of Trump's cases were in the register of cases that would allow even these hoodlum courts to throw out ballots and throw the election to Donald Trump. And so what we are shooting for is not, a victory, right, for Vice President Harris. It is a litigation proof victory where you would have to have Donald Trump calling up all the states and ask them to find him 11,000 votes in every state, which isn't going to happen even in the courts as we know it right now. I think part of the danger is, well, what if the margin of victory is small, let's say a few hundred votes, right? Or less than 1,000 votes in a handful of states. Well, then you might have some litigation that is filed by the Trump campaign or the RNC that says, actually, states counted some ballots that they shouldn't have. But the problem is states might not have sequestered different categories of ballots. And so if you don't really know like which ballots were wrongly counted and which ones were rightly counted, that raises the prospect of what they were trying to do in 2020, namely call into doubt the overall result and therefore allow a state legislature just to pick who the electors are going to vote for. And that's one possible path by which this gets to a system where Trump is trying to throw out the results of the election and install himself as president. I think it is more scary this time around in some ways because they basically had the trial run in 2020 and saw, well, here are some things we can do that might make it easier for us to steal some votes. But on the other hand, Donald Trump isn't currently president, and so he doesn't have the powers of the Department of Justice to threaten investigations into state elections, into non-existent voter fraud. And so in that sense is less concerning, but still at bottom, we need a litigation proof margin of victory.
So can I just add something to that? Getting a litigation proof victory is not something that happens on election day. It's something that happens now. So you can be a part of a litigation proof victory. Like, go figure out how to register some voters. Go figure out how to do some calls in swing states. Go do some postcards. I have written 1,000 postcards to swing voters at this point. Like, yes, I have. My hand is literally about to fall off.
I'm canvassing again this weekend, and I literally hate talking to strangers.
And then separately, let me maybe just so it doesn't sound like quite so didactic and terrible, although it is. I just finished this MSNBC special with Simone Sanders where we went around the country talking to Black women about the election. And, some of the stuff was a little alarming for me, like younger women who were like, I'm not sure if I'm going to vote. I was like, literally, girl, what are you talking about? So I was a little in my feelings. But then we did this conversation where Simone talked to some of the elder stateswomen of the Democratic Party, like Donna Brazile and Mignon Moore, and all of these great women who have been central to the Democratic Party. And one of the questions Simone asked them was, what happens if Kamala Harris doesn't win? What happens if Donald Trump wins? And this is what they said. And I it was so inspiring to me. They said, if Kamala Harris wins, then we know we'll have a partner. We'll have an ally to work to do the things that matter, whether it's paid leave or restoring reproductive rights, we'll have a partner. If she doesn't win, nothing is different except that we don't have a partner. We may have an antagonist, but the work still goes on. And so again, they just made this really clear. Like, this project It doesn't matter who wins. This is an ongoing project, and we need to be in the business of perfecting our union, making this a true multi-faith, multiracial democracy. And that work happens no matter who's in the White House, because that's work we have to do. And so it'd be great if
Mm.
we had a partner and an ally, but even if we don't, we're not giving up. We keep fighting.
Oh, I love that's like a game. Like once you score a point, you're not like you don't sit down, you're like, I'm done. The game is not over just because you win the point.
Even if she wins, there's going to be work to do. We've got to keep her
Mhm.
with a Senate that can do the work, a House that can do the work. All like there's work to do.
Love that. And I do feel like our messaging has been better on that. It is not we elect Kamala and she's going to be the goddess that fixes everything for us. That this has to be a team sport. Democracy is a team sport. So, we are talking a lot about the Supreme Court, especially since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, which was actually during season 2 of our podcast. And I remember how upset we all were, even though we got word that it was going to happen. Getting word that it was going to happen was shocking. Then when it did actually happen, it was like shocking all over again. So, were you as surprised as we were? How did you all process this?
When I testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee against Brett Kavanaugh's nomination to the United States Supreme Court, I said he was a reliable vote to overturn Roe versus Wade, and that it wasn't an idle threat. Like it was already a 5-4 Supreme Court majority when Justice Kennedy was on the court, and he was often wobbly on abortion rights anyway. If he were replaced by Brett Kavanaugh, that seemed clear to me where this would be. What's this? Let me say that again. If he replaced Justice Kennedy, as he was slated to do, it seemed obvious that Roe would be in the crosshairs. And, then not only did he replace Justice Kennedy, we later had in 2020 the death of Justice Ginsburg, and that cemented with the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett a 6-3 conservative supermajority. But we've been saying this since our first episode. We started the podcast in 2019, and we were very clear that Roe was in the crosshairs. People said that we were hyperbolic and fear-mongering witches and all kinds of things. But in fact, it turns out we were deadly accurate. And you're welcome, America.
What do you know? And I thought, didn't he say it was established law? Wasn't that what he told us all? So,
It's Did you ever see that movie Say Anything?
no, but now I probably want to.
It's a fabulous movie with John Cusack and
Mhm.
Ione Skye, probably one of the best teen angst movies of the late 80s, early 90s. But anyway, one of the characters has a boyfriend, Joe, and she makes up these songs. And one of the songs is Joe lies when he cries. And that's what I think of when I think of Brett Kavanaugh. Brett lies when he cries.
Oh, that's pretty good. Uh, so there's been a lot of talk lately about introducing term limits. I can't imagine why to the Supreme Court. I'm curious, can term limits help solve some of our issues or maybe age limits? Is that a thing we can do?
So I don't think term limits are really going to address the problem we are facing in the here and now, which is having a
Mm.
supermajority Republican Supreme Court that seems hell-bent on taking away people's freedoms and destroying every democratic regulatory initiative and every popular democratic policy. If you impose term limits, that's just going to apply going forward. That is to future Supreme Court justices. That's not actually going to change the court that we have now. So in that sense, it doesn't fix the problem. Of course, it will address some of the issues that gave us the court we have, like the problem of some geriatric 80-year-olds suddenly passing away, and that radically changing the ideological composition and direction of the Supreme Court. But it's not actually going to address the problem that this court faces. To do that, you would have to do things like change the number of justices on the Supreme Court, as well as pass statutes that restrict the authority of the Supreme Court. And that's kind of what you would have to do in order to address that particular problem.
So I will say, though, that the prospect of term limits is something that almost every other constitutional system around the world has. So in that sense, shifting to term limits would bring us into alignment with other constitutional courts, and going forward would, I think, make it less likely that people hold power well past the time when they likely should. Because Leah is correct. Our rights should not depend on whether an 80-year-old jurist had Metamucil that morning. I mean, that's an untenable situation. I don't know that age limits are necessarily a great idea, because I think the conservative legal movement would literally just appoint fetuses and toddlers to the court if that were the case. They
Oh,
just make
yeah, I
younger
didn't think
and
about that.
younger judges. So, there's that. There are other kinds of court reforms that obviously have been floated. Some of these could be done by Congress, some of these could be instituted by the court itself. People have talked about the court's ethical code of conduct, or misconduct, as it were, that lacks an enforcement mechanism. An enforcement mechanism could be mandated by Congress. The court could implement a enforcement mechanism of its own right, as Justice Kagan has recently advocated for herself and her colleagues. That hasn't actually happened, but that's one set of reforms. You could also have reforms that are more sweeping, like people have talked about recalibrating the court, adding more justices so that there is a justice for each of the 13 federal circuits. That's how they divide up all of the work across the country into these geographical regions. So that's one prospect. But yeah, like I mean, if you really want court reform, I think one thing you'd have to address just generally is the fact that we're only talking about court reform because justices have for so many years wielded their interpretive authority to shift constitutional law, because we have a constitutional amendment structure that actually doesn't work. It's really hard to amend the Constitution. So, the whole question of why we're in the situation we're in is about the fact that you can't update the Constitution very easily. We do rely on judicial interpretation, and sometimes judges issue interpretations that are just really off the wall and kind of nuts. And then you get a lot of these questions.
And I think a lot of the trust in those justices has really degraded over time, especially as more comes to light with ethics involving the Supreme Court and reforms around them. It seems like I did not realize how lucrative the Supreme Court could be with all of the things that you can get, like trips and stuff. Like, who knew? Maybe kids will go from like wanting to be a YouTube star now to want to be a Supreme Court justice, knowing how much stuff you can get from everyone. But I think that's not the point. Like, so is this something that we're seriously able to do? Like, can we help make the Supreme Court ethical again?
I mean, yes, we can. The question is whether we will. I think it's been a salutary development that the Senate Democrats have held hearings, on Supreme Court and ethics problems. I think the first step, or a first step, is bringing greater public attention to the problem of the Supreme Court's ethics. And only if you do that will you build a constituency that would be there to support meaningful ethics reform. The hearings is the first step. I think there has to be some sort of legislation in order to actually get an enforcement mechanism behind an actual ethics code, rather than a non-binding guidance document that the justices decide whether they want to abide by or not, which is what we currently have. So, I think we can absolutely do something about it. The other thing I would say is the other aspect of whether we can have an ethics code depends, I think, on whether we are willing to recalibrate the court. As Melissa was saying, I think it's very likely that there would be a majority on the Supreme Court, as is currently constituted, to invalidate a bunch of meaningful ethics reforms that have enforcement mechanisms outside of the Supreme Court. These are a group of people who largely regard themselves as kings and above the law and above the political system, rather than as part of it. And I think it's very likely that they would say, actually, Congress doesn't have the authority to tell us whether we can accept
Mm.
free PJ trips from our billionaire friends, or free stays at their Adirondacks resort, or whatever the case is. I mean, Justice Alito basically said as much to the Wall Street Journal. This isn't some big secret.
Like, relevantly, it's not simply that the court is on a sinecure, basically, that like court service is a sinecure where you get private jet travel and free vacations and all kinds of things. It's that the public recognizes that these decisions that often accrue in the favor of deregulatory interests, dark moneyed interests, it all seems connected. Like that's the
Mhm.
real point.
Mhm.
And it's not just that they're not disclosing, which by itself would be problematic. I think the reason why it's at such a fever pitch and so many Americans are rightly concerned and agitated about it is because it feels like many of them are in the bag for certain interests. Like these are just not disconnected billionaires who are just lavishing largesse on Clarence Thomas because they think he's a good guy. They're lavishing largesse on Clarence Thomas because he's Justice Thomas. And
Mhm.
they very frequently have interest, maybe not direct interest before the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court's decisions affect those emotional support billionaires in ways that are salutary. And it feels to most Americans who are playing by the rules that this is greasing the wheels.
Absolutely. I mean, so, all right, I'm not hearing a lot of hope on ethics reform right now or doing a lot to change right now. What about expanding the court? So this often gets put out there as this very radical idea. Like, all right, let's add 2 seats. Is this a radical idea? Should we be talking about this? Or is this just, completely out the window? Could never happen.
I mean, it was a radical idea to overthrow Roe versus Wade, but we talked about that and here we are.
Mm.
So let's talk about it.
Right. I mean, I would just say radical as compared to what? Is it more radical than having a group of Supreme Court justices allow states to torture women to death and deny them life-saving emergency medical care? No, I don't think so. Is it more radical than having the Supreme Court dismantle a crown jewel of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, based on nothing more than a bunch of mishmash of conservative feelings that they don't like having to win racial minorities votes? I don't think it's any more radical than that. We could go on and on. Is it more radical than having a group of Republican Supreme Court justices pick a Republican president? No, I don't think so. There are just so many examples of things that the Supreme Court has done that are fundamentally antithetical to being a democracy in which all people are represented and treated as equal, that I think in order to remain a democracy, we need to do something like democratizing the Supreme Court and not allowing these guys to just impose minority rule on us for perpetuity.
This
Oh,
is a Supreme
yes.
Court where a guy who didn't even win the popular vote has appointed a third of the court.
Hmm.
Like, wow. And they're issuing decisions that are wildly out of step with where the public is based on their vision of what the law is and what it should be. And they have no compunction toward restraint. Like in the 3 years in which they have had a full 6-3 conservative supermajority, they have overturned a major decision in every one of those 3 terms. Dobbs in the first term. We could also add Bruin, which really unsettled the Second Amendment and unsettled the settlement that had guided the country with regard to the Second Amendment for years. The next year, they dismantled affirmative action in higher education
Mhm.
admissions. And then just this past year, they disrupted the settlement over the administrative state, basically allowed deregulatory interests to have their way with bureaucracies and administrative agencies. And then they decided, as a cherry on top of this craptastic Sunday, they would let the president be a king and be completely, or at least mostly, immune from crime. Amazing.
I mean, that is truly amazing. And I don't know, like, man, they really want Biden
0
doing
out of
whatever he
10 would
wants right
not
now.
recommend.
I know.
Would not recommend.
Not all right. So what can we do? So I heard you mention like we can get informed about what's going on in the Supreme Court. What can we do to help change this and to get a Supreme Court that actually represents us and our interests?
There's short-term stuff and there's long-term stuff. So let's just focus on the short-term stuff. Nothing is going to change if Donald Trump is president in
Right?
this
I mean, it
next
could
term.
get
So, I
worse. It
mean,
could get worse.
exactly. I mean, like you want a
A lot worse.
72 conservative super majority. You know, the Heritage Foundation has already teed up Project
Mhm.
2025, which is basically taking everything the Supreme Court has laid a foundation for with all of its decisions over the last 3 years, and then it's just force multiplying it. So if you hated what happened in the Supreme Court, I mean, it's like those old
Mhm.
commercials for perfume. Like if you love Giorgio, you'll love Primo. If you hate what the Supreme Court has done over the last 3 years, you're going to really hate what Project 2025 has in store for you, because it's not just overruling Roe versus Wade. It's like menstrual surveillance and miscarriage surveillance. It's not just
Weird.
taking authority from agencies agencies and giving it to judges. It's kind of giving the techno bros control over major agencies, including agencies that regulate nuclear power. Like literally, the dudes who brought you crypto can now split atoms. It's going to be amazing. So that's just an initial like short-term issue. If Donald Trump wins in 2024, the Supreme Court is going to be further emboldened. It's going to do more, and it's going to be equipped with the other branches of government who are right in line behind it.
Oh, not scary at all. Not worried. Not worried at all. So,
Leo, do the long term. Do the long
oh
term.
yeah.
Yeah, so
All right,
longer
long
term,
term. Is it more hopeful?
longer yes and no.
No. Okay.
Longer term, as we were saying, you have to build a constituency for doing something about the court. That means, staying on stories about the court. That means going to, for example, primary meetings or organizing meetings and expressing an interest in the court. That means calling senators. To express, what are you doing about these judicial nominees? What are you doing about the court? That also means canvassing, to ensure that there is a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House so laws can actually be passed to rein in this Supreme Court. Those are things that have to happen over the longer run. Those are not things that happen in a single election cycle. Even if Democrats win the House, the Senate, and the presidency in this upcoming election, we have not spent the last 20 or 30 years building a Democratic constituency that understands the importance of the courts, and therefore we have not been selecting Democratic senators and representatives, all of whom understand the importance of the Supreme Court and doing something about the Supreme Court. And so that is a longer term project. It's probably going to start at the state and local level, getting involved in state and local elections and figuring out, well, who are the elected representatives? Who are the judges that kind of get the issues that are facing the federal courts and the Supreme Court, and then trying to get those people into federal office. And then once you eventually accumulate, enough political power, use that political power to democratize the country by democratizing the court. And that is going to take a longer time than, again, just November 2024. But the stakes of November 2024 are still huge as far as what we could lose and the opportunity costs and how much longer it might take us to get there.
I mean, I think that's real life, right? Real life is there aren't a simple quick fix, right? If anyone's telling you they have a simple quick fix, like that's not legit.
It's
Move
snake
on.
oil.
No, I mean,
Exactly.
this wasn't a quick fix. Like, this was a 50-year
Oh
concerted
yeah.
Yep.
campaign to capture the courts, overrule
Mm,
Roe, and set
Yep.
in motion this entire conservative
yes.
agenda. It's all
Yep.
coming to fruition, but it's all been part of this plan that has moved slowly and then very quickly. And so, whatever it is that turns this around, if in fact something does happen to turn it around, it's not going to be instantaneous and it's not going to happen overnight. This is a marathon, not a sprint. And people need to understand that and be engaged for the long term.